Hi everyone and welcome to another video. My name is Richard Seidlitz and I'm the owner of redpants.lol. In this video I'll be covering everything you need to know if you're in the market for an Aston Martin V8 Vantage. I'm making a follow-on video to this about V8 Vantage maintenance, and some of the information in each video will overlap, so it'll be a good idea to watch both videos whether you're in the market for an Aston or you've already got one. I'm about to cover a lot of information, so grab a Quarantini or a beer or a bottle of wine or two because this is going to be a very long video. Before we get started, let's go over some housekeeping. This video is about topics specific to these cars. All the usual car buying stuff still applies, even if I don't mention it. So check for an accident history and title status, get a pre-purchase inspection done by a certified professional, and verify whether or not recalls and TSBs have been performed. I'll have a bunch of links in the description below, so make sure you check those for more information about each topic that I touch upon, as well as some things that I may not mention. One last thing to note is the information I give in this video reflects my own experiences, research, and observations, as well as anecdotal information and input from other Aston owners. Buying an Aston Martin is a big investment, so make sure you do your own due diligence and research before committing. First things first, let's make sure we're all on the same page. This video is about the Aston Martin V8 Vantage, which was made from 2005 to 2018. Aston Martin has reused much of its nomenclature over the years, including the V8 engine notation and the Vantage name, both of these as trim levels and as distinct models, so it can be a bit confusing. An easy way to make sure that everybody's talking about the same thing when discussing a car is to say what year the car was made. This not only helps with specifying the model, it also helps within a specific model as various changes were made throughout each generation of each model. For example, a 2007 V8 Vantage like the one I have has a different engine, exhaust, brakes, interior, wheels, infotainment and navigation systems, front and rear bumpers, side sills and steering rack, among other things, compared to a 2017 V8 Vantage, despite them being the same model from the same generation. There are also differences between the trim levels for one specific year. For example, a 2011 V8 Vantage and a 2011 V8 Vantage S are not entirely the same. There are so many things to know about all these changes and differences that it can literally fill up a book. And that brings us to my first recommendation if you want to buy a V8 Vantage. This is the definitive guide to Gaydon-era Aston Martins. A gentleman named Grant compiled all the information you could possibly need about the models, trims, and changes, and so on. It's commonly referred to as the book, or as Grant's book, and it is one of the most valuable resources available to new owners and current owners alike. It does get updated occasionally, so make sure you're buying the latest edition. I'll have a link in the description below to help you find it. If you're new to Aston Martin, you may have some basic questions, so let's get those out of the way before getting into some really specific stuff. The first question is a common one, and yes, these cars are reliable. While previous Astons do have a reputation for being unreliable, the Gaydon-era cars are actually really well built and can take a fair amount of abuse. A major factor in this was the use of parts from other companies. When the DB9 and V8 Vantage were designed, Aston Martin was part of Ford's premium portfolio alongside Jaguar and Range Rover. Aston Martin used parts from those cars as well as from Volvo, which was also owned by Ford at the time. Most of the parts bin items are inconsequential to an owner or driver. Some things do stand out, like the Volvo nav unit and key fob that were used on earlier cars, but a Jaguar trunk lid wiring harness, for example, does absolutely nothing to take away from the car being an Aston Martin. Another thing that helps with reliability is the fact that the V8 Vantage was made for about 13 years. That's an incredibly long time for a single car to be built, but the benefit of that is that Aston Martin was able to roll out incremental updates and fixes for the newer cars as problems were discovered and solved on older ones. These fixes can usually be done retroactively on earlier cars, so the entire generation of V8 Vantage benefits from it. All this is not to say that the V8 Vantage is perfect. Of course it's not. It's a small volume, hand-built car, and there are going to be issues that can arise. But because so many of these issues have been documented, the cars are no longer the mysterious money pits that some people may think they are. As for how many miles you can put on these cars, many of us do daily drive our Astons. It isn't uncommon to see a V8 Vantage with 60 to 100,000 miles on the clock. Even my V8 Vantage has just shy of 85,000 miles, including numerous track days and rallies. Despite its looks, the V8 Vantage is an incredibly useful and practical car. Even though it only has 2 seats, the coupe has a parcel shelf behind those seats and a massive trunk. The Roadster doesn't have the parcel shelf, and it sacrifices some of the trunk space for the folding roof, but it still has enough room for a couple medium-sized pieces of luggage. Being sporty and having plenty of cargo space makes the V8 Vantage a perfect car for multi-day rallies and track days. And since it looks so damn good, you can even drive it from the track day to a nice restaurant and it'll still be kept right up front. In addition to daily driving, track days, and rallies, I've driven mine through snow and ice when I lived up in Virginia and through torrential downpours while living down here in Florida. So long as you're driving according to the conditions and you have the right tires if you want to brave the snow and ice, it can be driven year-round. I will say that dealing with heavy rainfall has been far more difficult than the ice and snow, simply because I've lowered my car and I have to deal with a lot of flooded areas during the rainy season here in the Tampa Bay area. If you're worried about fuel efficiency, this is not the car for you. You can expect mid to high teen miles per gallon on average, and don't be surprised if your miles per gallon drop into the single digits in the instant fuel economy display when really pushing the car. This isn't hyperbole by any means. In highway cruising, I get about 20 miles per gallon, and my average overall hovers around 16 miles per gallon. But this can drop very quickly. Flat out on track, my reading drops down to about 3 miles per gallon. Seriously. And premium fuel is required, so set aside some extra gas money if you really want to have fun with this car. Now, insurance is a big variable for any potential buyer, but there isn't much I can do to help you here. These cars can be expensive to cover, and not all insurance companies will offer you a policy for them at all. So check with your insurance company for rates and consider shopping around if you need to. If all of that sounds fine and you want to get a V8 Vantage of your own, let's go over how to narrow down your choices. First, expect to search nationwide if you're in the US or internationally if you're in the EU or elsewhere. Some areas do have a decent number of Astons running around, but they're still relatively rare. To get the exact car you want, you may need to fly somewhere to pick it up or have the car shipped back to you. Second, set your budget. This should include the price you'll pay for the car, plus a PPI, plus any airfare or shipping if needed, plus any taxes, registrations, or other fees, plus any maintenance or repairs if the car needs them, so on and so forth. Setting a limit on the price you'll pay for the car based on this overall budget will narrow down the model years you'll be looking at. The general rule of thumb is the newer the car, the more expensive it is. You can also expect to see price jumps going from the 4.3 to the 4.7 liter engine and premiums being charged for manuals over SportShift. Third, pick your transmission. People in the market for a V8 Vantage constantly ask if they should buy a manual or SportShift. The manual is fantastic in my opinion, but the SportShift is generally a love or hate choice. If you don't know which one to get, drive them both. Don't take my word for this, and do not take the opinions of others until you have driven both for yourself, because this is extremely subjective. I'll go into this in a lot more detail at the end of the video, so make sure you watch that portion if you're on the fence. Fourth, pick your must-have options. This includes the obvious like paint and leather colors, but also equipment like navigation, premium audio, auto-dimming mirrors, and cruise control. Yes, even cruise control and auto-dimming mirrors were options, so make sure the car you're looking at specifically has them. Something to keep in mind, even if you don't think you want certain options like the navigation, for example, is that they may be worthwhile to a buyer if and when you go to sell the car, so it might be a good idea to buy the most well-equipped car that you can that still suits your own tastes. Fifth, decide if a car that you're looking at has the history you want. For some people, service and accident history just doesn't matter. For others, a perfect bill of health and a full service history, or FSH, will be a requirement. This is going to figure into the price you'll pay for a car, or if you're willing to buy it at all. If you're looking for an Aston Martin online, especially in forums and Facebook groups with a global membership, you'll see a diverse range of opinions about this. For example, a full service history with dealership stamps is often a specific requirement for the Brits, while those of us in the US aren't really concerned with who has done the work so long as it's done properly. Once you've used those criteria to narrow down your selections, you need to make sure a car is in good condition before you agree to buy it. A pre-purchase inspection, or PPI, is costly, often several $100s, but it's an investment that helps ensure you don't get stuck with a very expensive lemon. If the car isn't local, you'll need to arrange for the PPI to happen and then travel to see the car in person if the PPI does check out. A PPI will often not cover cosmetic issues, and cosmetics can be very expensive to fix on an Aston Martin. This is why I highly recommend inspecting the car in person even if the PPI looks fine. And this is where things can get really intimidating. You can easily spend well over $1,000 for a PPI and travel just to check a car that you may end up not buying. And then you have to spend it again for the next car you look at. The red V8 Vantage I bought a few years ago, for example, required several $1,000s to fix some issues that hadn't been disclosed by the seller. I knew I was gambling by buying the car sight unseen, and in the end, I did not come out on top. A cheap flight from Virginia to Texas would have saved me a lot of time, money, and hassle in the long run. So don't take the value of a PPI too lightly.
Probably have to give it some gas.
I wish it had an automatic.
Now that we've gone over the basics, let's get into the specific things to look for when inspecting a V8 Vantage that you're interested in buying. The first thing you'll see when looking at an Aston Martin or any car is the exterior, so let's start there. Aston Martin paint can be very expensive to fix, so make sure the car's paint is in good condition. Rock chips are going to be the most common form of damage, and there are a few places to check that are more prone to rock chips than the rest of the car. The front of the car will get hit by rocks and other debris being kicked up by other cars that are in front of you, and the area in front of the rear wheels will get hit by whatever is kicked up by the car's own front tires. Another place to check the paint is along the character line that runs across each door. These sharp creases are often the victim of door dings from other vehicles, so make sure you check them. Aston Martin did have the foresight to add some protective clear vinyl to the cars. However, it was only done in a limited fashion. It was put on the front bumper fascia and the leading edge of the hood, and on the area directly in front of the rear wheels. The problem with both of these is that they didn't cover enough area to actually protect those parts of the cars. Plus, there wasn't any protection at all for those door character lines or the rest of the body. As far as the factory clear vinyl is concerned, wear and tear will be natural, and the clear vinyl can turn a little bit yellow over time. In either case, it's a good idea to replace the clear vinyl occasionally. I'll go a lot more into this topic in depth during my V8 Vantage maintenance video that's going to follow this one, but the thing to know while buying a car is that it isn't uncommon for the clear vinyl section to need to be replaced. The door mirrors are a beautiful feature on the V8 Vantage, and yes, they are from Volvo, but they look fantastic on these cars because of the mirror arms. However, the mirror arms have been prone to corrosion, so make sure you check them and ensure that all the black finish is still intact. If it isn't, the arms will need to be replaced or refinished. Refinishing is a relatively easy job, so that's what I would recommend if needed, and I wouldn't personally consider corrosion on the mirror arms to be a deal breaker on a car that I'm interested in buying. Some cars also have had corrosion issues around the door handles and on the rear subframes underneath the car, so make sure you check those places as well. One of the strangely concerning things to consider when buying an Aston Martin is the exterior lighting. The headlights and taillights each incorporate LEDs, and while the LED diodes, that's the bulbs themselves, last an incredibly long time, the circuit boards that control the LED diodes are prone to failure. Although it can be done, the headlights and taillights were not designed to be serviceable, so replacement is the most common way to fix a unit that is not working properly. And they're very expensive, so be wary about this when you're looking at a car. Circuit board failure is caused by condensation within the headlights and taillights, so make sure you check that the lights are fully functioning and that there's no condensation or moisture inside of them when looking at a car. The hood, doors, and trunk all use gas struts to be propped open. These struts do wear out over time, so if you open up one of these and it doesn't stay open, you know the struts need to be replaced. These are not expensive maintenance items, and aside from a little extra work to replace the ones on the doors, they're pretty easy to do, so don't let these scare you away if the car you're interested in has struts that need to be replaced. There's also a small strut for the fuel filler lid of the V8 Vantage Roadster, but not one for the coupe. Either way, whether it's a Roadster or coupe, make sure that the fuel filler lid door opens properly when using the release button inside the door sill. If the lid doesn't pop open all the way when the button is pressed, it'll need to be addressed. There's a manual release inside the trunk, and in many cases you can use a credit card or driver's license to pop the lid open after you press the release button inside, so you shouldn't be stranded if the button doesn't fully release the lid. A common thing I see is distortion in the rubber seals between the hood and the fenders. This is caused by one thing: dropping the hood to close it. When the hood is dropped, it blows out the rubber seals. Then you have pressure from the weight of the hood and heat cycling from the engine, which causes the seals to reshape, and then they no longer sit flush how they're supposed to. Once this happens, the seals need to be replaced, so take a look at them when inspecting a car. And seriously, stop dropping the hood to close it. Just set it down and firmly but gently press it shut until you hear the latch click. The last thing I want to cover out here is the front under tray. Now this is a strange thing to mention, but the reason this panel is worth mentioning is because it can be an indicator of a front end impact. It is impossible to see the nose of an Aston Martin from the driver's seat, so it's very common for people to hit curbs or parking posts or small children with the front lip of the car. The front under tray is made of thin, malleable metal, so it bends very easily under that impact. Now, it can be bent back into shape, and that's actually a good thing for an owner that doesn't want to spend hundreds of dollars replacing it. But if you are worried about some kind of undisclosed impact, look at the front under tray and see if it looks like it had been bent before, as this might give you a bit of a clue. Now that we've looked around the outside of the car, let's take a look inside. The first thing we will see when opening up a car door is the driver's seat, and it's something to pay attention to. The most common issue I've seen is excessive wear on the outer seat bolsters. The V8 Vantage sits very low to the ground, so a lot of people will fall into the car and then climb out of it, both of which will put a lot of wear and tear on the outer bolsters of the seats. A less common thing I see is sagging leather on the seats, but it can happen. Fixing these issues may involve a new seat cover, which can be very expensive, or you might be able to find a highly skilled automotive upholstery shop to do the repairs if needed. You will need some new leather, and the upholstery shop will have to match the original pattern and the stitching itself to get it to look just right. It can be costly, so this is something that you might want to pay attention to. The standard door bars are made of painted metal. And while these are generally quite durable, it isn't uncommon to see chips in them from the seatbelt buckles, as it's very easy for the buckles to hit the door bars when taking off your seatbelt. The leather panels behind the door bars are another place to check for excessive wear, as it's very easy for someone's rings or nails to scratch that area whenever a person is grabbing at the door bar. Speaking of the seatbelt, check it for excessive fraying, as this has happened on some cars. And do not be surprised if the leather guide loop at the top of the seat's shoulder bolster doesn't work properly. These have always been problematic, and half the cars that I've dealt with or driven had floppy guide loops. It's just one of those things you kind of smile, laugh, and pretend it's not there. Next, take a look at the main control panel. The button labels on the early interiors like this one are prone to wearing off. The button packs are replaceable, but they could be very expensive, and pulling this control panel out can be a bit of a pain. You'll also want to make sure the buttons work, as well as the joystick for the nav control, which can fail, albeit rarely. Speaking of the navigation system, make sure the nav screen opens smoothly and freely. If it doesn't, the gears for the screen unit likely need to be replaced. This can be a DIY job, and the gears are cheap, so don't be worried if that's the case. However, if the gears aren't to blame, the nav screen unit itself may need to be replaced, and that thing is very expensive. Ill-fitting carpet like this was common on the earlier V8 Vantage, so don't be too surprised if you see it. You can add some double-sided tape to the back of it and press it into place against the center tunnel to help mitigate it, and that's going to be the easiest and cheapest way to fix it. The floor mats double as the bottom carpeting, and they have bolt holes under the seats to be fixed in place, but many people aren't aware of this and rip the holes trying to pull the floor mats free. Once that happens, they may never stay perfectly in place once put back in the car. This may seem like a small thing, but a moving floor mat can be a serious hassle while driving. I've saved a big one for last in the interior, and that is the issue of shrinking leather. While Aston Martin uses leather to make their interiors much nicer than the average car, that same leather can cause some serious headaches for owners. Check to make sure the leather is not pulling back from the edges of the interior trim panels, especially the ones on the dashboard and the instrument cluster hood. It's widely said that the glue used on earlier cars was insufficient for hotter climates, which would then get soft and allow the leather to pull back from the edges of those trim panels. However, I spoke with somebody at Aston Martin that deals with interiors, and he told me that it could be the panel underneath that is also an issue. While this is purely cosmetic, keep in mind that Aston Martin does not keep leather parts like these trim pieces in stock. They're made to order, and it takes 4 to 6 weeks to get a replacement. If you address it early enough, a good automotive upholstery shop may be able to repair the trim piece by removing the leather and then rebonding it to the panel. And this is generally the best way to go, as it'll ensure your leather is still a perfect match for the rest of your interior despite any aging or fading. And it will be far less expensive and much quicker than getting a replacement from Aston Martin. There are a few accessories that can come with a brand new Aston Martin, but don't always expect these accessories to be handed over to the next owner when the original owner of the car sells it. These can include optional accessories like branded umbrellas and luggage, or even basics like a second key fob or tow hook. And yes, the tow hook is an oddly often missing item from a car when it's sold used. Another one is the leather elbow pad that sits inside the cup holder in cars with the updated armrest, which started around 2008. Most accessories can be bought new or used if you'd like to replace the missing ones or just get some new ones of your own, and I've come to expect these things to be missing from a car, as original owners tend to keep them as souvenirs anyway, so don't be surprised if they're not there when you look at a car. Having looked at both the exterior and interior, let's address one last thing to look for: garage rot. Garage rot is what I call all the things that can go bad because a car sits unused for too long. Much of this should be covered by the PPI, but I want to take a moment to address the topic in general because it can be such a big deal for Astons. There are many parts of a car that need to move and function in order to stay in good condition. Rubber seals, for example, will dry out if they don't move and get lubricated on a somewhat regular basis. This is especially true of the seals in suspension struts. Once a seal dries out in a strut, it can start to leak, and a leaking strut isn't going to be able to function as well as it should, and the ride quality and handling of the car can suffer for it. The factory struts from Aston Martin aren't meant to be serviceable, so they generally need to be replaced when they start to leak. This can cost several $100s or more each, and they should be replaced in pairs, plus having to pay for installation and a new alignment, so you can see how this can get really expensive really quickly. I'll be diving into garage rot in more depth in my next video about V8 Vantage maintenance, but I thought it'd be worth mentioning as part of the buyer's guide to help frame expectations, because there are such thing as too many miles on some cars, but many people may not realize that there can also be too few. So far, this video has been about the various things to check on a V8 Vantage that generally would not be covered by a PPI. But before we end, I want to circle back to the SportShift transmission, which I mentioned earlier on. It's very important to know that the SportShift is not an automatic transmission. It is an automated manual transmission. It does not have a torque converter. It does have a clutch. Even though it's often referred to as the auto option as compared to the manual, it is not an automatic transmission. It's the same concept as a BMW SMG, Lamborghini E-Gear, or Ferrari F1 transmission. I really need to stress this point because so many people drive the SportShift expecting it to act like an automatic and then absolutely hate it. If you want any chance of liking this transmission, you need to set your expectations based on what it is and what it is not. The best way to drive a SportShift car is to treat it like a manual. Use the paddles to shift it yourself and lift off on the throttle at least a little bit while shifting. The auto mode is clunky at best, and honestly it's a bit rubbish, and it's so much better when driven like the manual transmission that it actually is. Knowing this and doing it can make all the difference in the world for whether or not a person likes the SportShift transmission. I said it earlier and I'll say it again. Don't take anyone's word on whether or not you should buy a SportShift or manual until you've driven both, and you've driven both properly. This isn't meant to offend all the SportShift haters out there, but I've talked to way too many people that complained about the SportShift transmission until they learned how to drive it the right way. So there we have it, everything you need to know when buying an Aston Martin V8 Vantage. Again, these are cars, so all the usual car buying stuff still applies regardless of whether or not it was mentioned in this video. But hopefully the specifics I covered here will help you with finding and buying a car and sets you up for a great ownership experience. If you haven't done so already, please like and subscribe if you'd like to support my channel, and turn on those notifications so you get alerted when other videos come out, including the one for V8 Vantage Maintenance, which will be coming soon after this one. And don't forget to check out www.redpants.lol for all the information and parts that you need for your Aston Martin. See you next time.